Kelly paced nervously around her apartment, holding back tears after yet another fight with Liam. They had been looking forward to this concert for weeks, buying tickets in advance and planning a trip to nearby Beaumont, but everything had gone awry. Kelly wasn't even sure how things had escalated so quickly. A minor disagreement had turned into a huge argument. Liam had started yelling, insisting he wasn't going anywhere if she was going to ruin the entire evening with her attitude. Anger boiled inside her. They had been together for over a year, and every argument seemed to get worse. This time, she felt like she just couldn't take it anymore. Frustrated and hurt, Kelly decided to go by herself. She wasn't going to sit at home and wallow in her resentment. The tickets couldn't go to waste, and she needed a break. Beaumont was only a few hours away by bus, but when she finally dashed out of her apartment and made it to the bus station, the bus had already left. She helplessly watched it disappear, feeling another wave of anger rise within her, this time directed at herself and at Liam. Now her phone was dying. There were only a few % of battery left, and calling a taxi or anyone else was no longer an option. She stood by the road, where the light from the street lamps mixed with the thick twilight. The highway stretched out like a long, dark serpent winding between fields, and every sound from a passing car echoed in her mind like a warning signal. It was quiet and lonely, but Kelly didn't want to go home after the fight. She subconsciously hoped that a trip to the concert would help clear her mind and distract her from Liam. The only option left was to hitchhike. It was a risky plan, but she had no other choice. Kelly stood on the shoulder, trying to catch any passing car, but more than an hour went by with no luck. Anxiety gripped her, but she kept telling herself everything would be fine. Finally, the headlights of an old blue pickup truck appeared. It slowed down and came to a stop beside her, like some ghost from the past. A middle-aged man peeked out, a barely noticeable smile on his face. He introduced himself as Joe and offered to give her a ride to Beaumont. At first, Kelly hesitated, but Joe seemed friendly, and his voice was calm, even a bit soothing. Besides, the thought of being alone on this road scared her more than getting into an old truck with a stranger. She climbed into the passenger seat, trying not to show her anxiety. Joe smiled briefly and started the engine. They drove in silence for the first few minutes, and Kelly almost began to relax. But then she noticed something strange. There was an odd, barely perceptible smell in the truck, a mix of chemicals and something musty. She glanced at the driver out of the corner of her eye and saw that his smile looked a little too forced, as if he was trying hard to appear friendly but was actually distant and detached. Kelly tried to calm herself. Maybe he was just nervous about giving a ride to a stranger, or the truck was old and smelled like dust or motor oil. However, deep in her mind, a cold fear was beginning to creep in, one that she was desperately trying to ignore. She rolled down the window, hoping to let in some fresh air, but it didn't help. The smell only intensified, like a reminder of something sinister that was inexorably approaching. Kelly sat in tense silence, trying to quell her inner turmoil. Outside the window, darkness swirled, with only the occasional tiny road sign passing by, none of which she recognized. They should have crossed a few familiar markers by now, but nothing looked right. The road felt foreign and endless, winding aimlessly through the night. She tried to calm herself, but her mind screamed danger, making her heart pound wildly in her chest. "Are you sure we're going in the right direction?" Kelly cautiously asked, attempting to infuse her voice with as much confidence as possible, even though her hands were barely shaking. Joe glanced briefly at her but didn't respond. He smiled slightly, as if he just heard something incredibly funny, and returned his gaze to the road. His silence was thick and suffocating. "We should have passed Beaumont by now," she continued, slightly more insistent. "Are you sure you haven't gotten lost?" "Oh no, I know exactly where we're going," Joe finally said, his voice calm but cold, like an icy wind. "Sometimes it's even more interesting to drive on new roads, don't you think?" That didn't sound like a normal conversation starter. There was a subtle hint of something in his words that sent shivers down Kelly's spine. She clutched her bag tightly and uncertainly turned her gaze back to the window. The trees flickering past in the darkness looked the same, like a trap from which she couldn't escape. There have been other passengers, you know. Joe suddenly spoke, breaking the silence into pieces. Some, like you, thought they were going to a concert or visiting friends, but not all of them made it to where they intended. Kelly felt her breath catch in her throat. She tried to remember if she'd mentioned anything about the concert, but couldn't recall such a moment. Her fingers instinctively reached for the door handle, even as she desperately tried to mask her fear. But when she pressed the handle, the lock wouldn't budge. The metal was old and rusty, and her push produced only a dry click. Panic surged in her throat like a terrifying wave that was about to swallow her whole. "Once there was a girl who looked like you," Joe continued, not taking his eyes off the road. "Pretty, cheerful, but for some reason she got scared. Started running around, banging on the windows like a bird in a cage. I've always wondered why they react like that, even though I'm just trying to help." Kelly was gasping for air, and every movement became more awkward as her fingers lost their sensitivity from fear. She tried again, but it was futile. The door wouldn't open. Then she looked around the cab and noticed something on the seat upholstery that made her palms go cold. Dark stains resembling dried blood. Just the sight of those stains made her nauseous. But the worst part was that the smell she had noticed earlier now seemed sharper and more distinct. It was the scent of decay, thick and suffocating, making her want to vomit. Involuntarily, she reached her foot toward the mat beneath her. When she touched it, something crunched underneath, as if small bones or teeth lay hidden there. Kelly recoiled, pulling her foot back. Her heart pounded so hard she felt it might burst apart. "It's all right," Joe suddenly said, noticing her nervous movements. He slowly pressed the gas pedal, and the vehicle lurched forward. "Soon we'll be where we need to be." Those words sounded like a sentence. Kelly couldn't shake the nagging thoughts about the warnings she had heard since childhood. Her mom always said, "Never get into a car with strangers. It's always a risk, even if they seem friendly." But back then, Kelly thought the world wasn't that dangerous. She just wanted to feel free after a fight with her boyfriend. His mocking words and criticisms still echoed in her head. He accused her of being too emotional and not knowing how to have fun. In the end, Kelly decided to go alone because she didn't want to give up her concert tickets. Now, sitting on this unfamiliar road in a car with a man who made her skin crawl, she realized that the fight was nothing compared to what was happening now. And it was her boyfriend's fault she was sitting there, alone and unsupported. Kelly pressed against the door, hoping to find some kind of escape, but the car raced relentlessly through the night. Her fingers slid across the window. The cold glass felt like a trap, separating her from the world she could no longer reach. Suddenly, in the distance, red and blue lights flashed again. Patrol car. Her heart raced. This was it, a chance to escape. Joe slowed down as the officer gestured for them to stop. The car rolled slowly to the shoulder, and Kelly barely suppressed the impulse to fling open the door and run outside. She held her breath, hoping this time would be different. The officer approached the car, shining a flashlight inside. His stern gaze swept from Joe to Kelly. "Everything okay?" the officer asked, peering inside. Kelly felt a spark of hope reignite in her chest. She opened her mouth to call for help, but Joe spoke first. His voice was calm, almost too soft. "Oh, good evening, officer. Sorry for the trouble. You see, this is my niece. We had a little family conflict, and I'm taking her home. She's a bit scared, but everything's under control." Kelly felt her body freeze with fear. She saw the officer's expression change. The stern look melted into a sympathetic smile. "Tough day, huh?" The officer leaned closer to the window and gave her a quick glance. "You okay, miss?" Kelly tried to gather herself. She wanted to scream, bang on the window, do anything to convince him. But Joe gripped her wrist tightly, subtly but firmly enough for her to understand. One wrong move and it would end badly. His fingers were cold, like metal clamps. "She's just tired," Joe added, still smiling. "Long day." The officer hesitated for a few seconds, looking at her, but Kelly felt the situation slipping out of control. Her breathing became erratic, tears welled in her eyes, but she forced herself to nod, trying to suppress the sobs that threatened to burst out. "Well then," the officer said, stepping back, "take care of yourselves, and try not to fight so much. All right?" "Of course, officer. Thank you for understanding," Joe replied, never releasing her wrist. The patrol car moved on, leaving them alone in the dark. Kelly felt her last hope shatter into pieces. Joe pressed the gas again, and the car quickly returned to the highway. His fingers finally released her hand, but a deep mark remained on her wrist. The silence inside the cabin grew even heavier, almost unbearable. Joe didn't speak anymore. He stared intently at the road ahead, as if he knew exactly where he was taking her. Kelly sensed something threatening hung in the air, like before a storm. Then, without taking his eyes off the road, he suddenly spoke. "They all thought someone would save them too," he said, almost whispering. "Each one hoped something would change at the last moment. But it didn't happen, and it won't happen for you." His voice was almost indifferent, like someone telling a story that repeated over and over again. A genuine horror gripped Kelly, cold seeping into her bones. She realized she was now completely at his mercy, and there was no turning back. On a distant, desolate highway, with nothing around but sand dunes, Joe suddenly stopped the car. The lights of an old, abandoned motel flickered in the distance, like shadows luring them into a trap. It looked as if someone had once tried to restore their shine, but abandoned after horrific events. These ghostly lights frightened Kelly more than anything else. "We should stop for the night," he said, a smile that sent chills down her spine. "Get some rest before the road." Kelly tried to argue, but his gaze was piercing and unwavering. When she stepped out of the car, her legs trembled with fear. The old motel, with its cracked walls and darkened windows, smelled of dampness mixed with a sense of time forgotten. In a room that hadn't seen guests in ages, Joe effortlessly tied Kelly up with ropes. As she began to panic, he merely smiled, and his grin made her heart freeze. "No one will know where you are," he said coldly, pressing down on her wrist. "And no one will save you." His hands, like iron clamps, squeezed her as Kelly felt the blood stop flowing to her limbs, and the feeling of helplessness grew. She started to struggle, trying to break free, but he just laughed, his voice echoing in the emptiness. Joe pulled out a knife, and the light from the lamp in the room glinted off its shiny blade, scattering a dangerous sparkle across the walls. Kelly watched in horror as he slowly dragged it across her skin, leaving small red lines that burned her but didn't cut deep. "You're not the first," he whispered, "and you won't be the last. I love it when they fight back." A chilling calm enveloped the room, accentuating what felt like past tragedies. In the bathroom, which was filled with shadows, an old camera stood, remnants of ancient events visible in the dark. Old clothes and stains on the walls silently bearing witness to victims who had once found themselves here. The air was thick with despair, as if time had stopped to preserve these horrific memories. Joe continued to terrorize her, keeping her in a state of constant panic. He reveled in her fear, and his words seeped into her consciousness like poison gas, filling her thoughts with hopelessness. She felt the room closing in, terror gripping her like an icy wind in the dark. Kelly realized that in every scream for help, he would only find pleasure. She kept fighting, but his strength seemed limitless, and her energy quickly drained. She began to feel her mind shatter, like a fragile porcelain figurine breaking under pressure. In the old, abandoned motel, where the darkness felt particularly oppressive, Joe carried on with his brutal game. Kelly, bound and helpless, felt fear consuming her. Her heart raced in a chaotic rhythm, and every sound from outside seemed distant and trivial, as if reality itself was trying to hide from the horror unfolding inside. Enjoying her helplessness, Joe began to threaten her with words that left no room for doubt. His voice was cold and calculated as he said that she wasn't the first to fall into his hands. Kelly felt everything inside her tear apart, and she wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. She tried to look away, but Joe kept advancing, his hands searching for ways to inflict pain. He started with physical control, squeezing her body as if he wanted to break her will. The girl felt panic rising, and eventually, he moved on to brutal acts, forcing her to endure horrific moments that rooted themselves in her consciousness like deep wounds on her skin. In those moments of despair and helplessness, she realized she was placing herself under his control. Kelly was cornered, where every movement of hers only heightened his satisfaction. He ruthlessly ignored her tears streaming down her face and her pleas for help, which only fueled his sense of power. His touches, though cruel, left marks in her memory of not just physical but emotional violence that would never fade. Kelly understood that, in that moment, she had lost everything. Every memory of her former life felt increasingly distant as Joe continued his torment. She wanted to hold on to at least a part of her dignity, but it seemed impossible. Ultimately, her consciousness began to dim, yielding to the terror that filled her heart. When she finally lost consciousness, her thoughts were flooded with images from the past. Happy moments, hopes, and dreams that lay beyond this horrific place. As she sank into darkness, Kelly felt her soul trying to escape this hell, but her body remained captive. It was a night she would never forget. Joe unexpectedly wakes Kelly, announcing that it's time for them to move on. They stop at a gas station in the middle of the desolate desert, and he goes inside to buy coffee. This is her only chance for salvation. Seizing the moment, Kelly frees her hands from the ropes. Her willpower drives her to act. Kicking the lock, she bolts for the door, which bursts open with a crack. As she rushes out onto the road, she feels her heart pounding in rhythm with fear. No longer looking back, she tries to reach a safe place, using every ounce of strength she has left. One thought races through her mind: run while you can. But Joe spots her through the shop window. His eyes fill with rage, and he charges after her like a beast on the hunt. "You're mine, Kelly. You won't escape," he shouts, his voice echoing off the walls of the empty gas station. The wind whistles in her ears as Kelly feels fear seep into her bones. Shiny beads of sweat trickle down her forehead, and each step feels heavy, as if the ground beneath her has turned to thick mud. She runs recklessly, stumbling over pebbles bouncing beneath her feet, desperately searching for any signs of life along the desolate highway. A wild scream erupts from her heart, one that will never be heard. But Joe quickly catches up to her. He's like a predator sensing its prey, and his heavy footsteps thud in her ears like thunder. "You can't escape me, Kelly." His voice, filled with hatred, shatters the silence, his words sounding as if he's reveling in the moment. She can feel his breath becoming labored as he closes in on her, and it gives her strength, but it's not enough. Kelly keeps running, trying not to think about how fast he's gaining on her. Her heart races so violently it feels like it's about to leap from her chest. She glances back and sees Joe lunging off the pavement, his face twisted in fury. "I'm going to get you," he screams, his voice charged with insane excitement, pulling her away from reality. Suddenly, he grabs her by the hair, knocking her to the ground. "Thought you could get away? You know I'll always find you." His words are filled with venom, leaving her no chance to escape. Panic grips her as she feels his weight and strength pressing down on her. Joe leans in closer, and at the moment she tries to break free, he quietly whispers, "You wanted this, didn't you?" Joe presses her to the ground and coldly slits her throat with a knife, her screams of horror lost in the silence of the desert. Blood slowly seeps into the sand, leaving behind only fear and helplessness. Kelly feels life slipping away from her, and the world around her becomes blurred and formless. Kelly lay on the cold ground, still feeling the last echoes of her struggle. Suddenly, her cries, lost in the emptiness of the desert, drew attention. A gas station worker, hearing the sounds of a struggle, stepped outside. His heart froze as he saw Joe brutally pursuing Kelly. Shocked, the worker grabbed his phone and called the police. "Help! There's a girl in danger." But while he was speaking, Joe calmly returned to his truck, nonchalantly trying to maintain his composure. He was already on the phone when he dialed the number, saying, "It's done. Ready for the next one." Soon, the sounds of sirens shattered the stillness of the night desert as a police car arrived at the scene. It was Sergeant Hank, familiar with Joe, his partner in crime. When Hank got out of the car, his face remained calm, as if nothing had happened. He approached the worker, who was still trembling with fear. "What happened here?" The worker, barely holding back his panic, pointed at Kelly. "She's in danger. That man." Hank, hearing this, nodded calmly, as if he suspected nothing. But in his eyes, there was already cold calculation. He knew how to quickly turn the situation to his advantage. After that, Hank, quietly observing the situation, drew his gun and shot the worker, eliminating the witness on the spot. "Done. No one will know what happened here," Hank declared, satisfied as he wiped his shooting finger. "Take them for organs. We'll sell them to someone who needs them." Joe nodded, pulling out papers confirming their collaboration, and began erasing all traces from the gas station's security cameras. "Clean everything up and it'll be quiet here," Hank said. He was the same cop who stopped them on the highway yesterday. A few minutes later, the blue truck disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind only the dead silence of the desert. The ominous calm that settled over everything that had happened became even more foreboding as their dark collaboration enveloped all around. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the story, so leave a comment below. And remember, never get into a car with strangers, even if they seem harmless. You never know what they might be thinking.